November 17, 2013, a tornado touched down in Washington, Illinois that would be remembered as one of the most destructive and terrifying weather events in modern American history. But what made this tornado truly different from all the others wasn't just its power or the damage it caused. It was the way it seemed to hunt people down with an intelligence that scientists still can't fully explain. The story of the Washington tornado is one that keeps meteorologists up at night, not just because of what happened, but because of how it happened. This wasn't just another violent storm. This was something that seemed to have a mind of its own, making decisions that tornadoes aren't supposed to make, targeting structures in ways that defied the normal rules of nature. And by the time it was over, an entire community would be changed forever, and our understanding of what tornadoes are capable of would be challenged in ways we never thought possible. Before we dive into what happened on that terrifying November day, we need to understand that tornadoes in November are already unusual. Most people think of tornadoes as a spring phenomenon, something that happens in April and May when warm and cold air masses collide over the Great Plains. But November tornadoes are a different beast entirely. They're rarer, but when they do occur, they often carry a ferocity that spring tornadoes sometimes lack. The atmospheric conditions that create a November tornado are more extreme, more violent, and more unpredictable. The jet stream dips further south, pulling down Arctic air, while warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico pushes northward. When these two massive air masses meet, the results can be catastrophic. The morning of November 17th started out deceptively calm in Washington, Illinois. Washington is a small city located in central Illinois, just east of Peoria. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where kids ride their bikes to school, and where the biggest excitement on a Sunday afternoon might be a high school football game. The population was around 11,000 people, and it was the kind of community where neighbors looked out for each other. Houses lined quiet streets with names like Sunset Drive and Maple Lane. There were parks where families gathered for picnics in the summer, and where Christmas lights would soon be going up for the holiday season. But that morning, meteorologists at the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, were watching something develop that made them deeply concerned. A powerful low-pressure system was moving across the central United States, and the atmospheric setup was becoming increasingly dangerous. Warm, moist air was streaming northward from the Gulf of Mexico, and temperatures in Illinois were reaching into the mid-70s, which is extremely unusual for mid-November. At the same time, a strong jet stream was diving down from Canada, bringing with it cold, dry air. The wind shear, which is the change in wind speed and direction with height, was off the charts. These are the ingredients for tornadoes, and not just any tornadoes, but violent, long-track tornadoes capable of causing extreme damage. By late morning, the Storm Prediction Center had issued a moderate risk of severe weather for parts of Illinois, which is a significant alert. Moderate risk days are when meteorologists expect widespread severe weather, including the possibility of strong tornadoes. Local television stations in Peoria and surrounding areas began covering the threat, telling people to stay alert and have multiple ways to receive warnings. But even with all the warnings, even with meteorologists doing everything right, nothing could truly prepare the people of Washington for what was about to unfold. The first tornado warnings of the day began going out around 10 in the morning for areas south and west of Washington. Storms were beginning to fire up along the cold front, and some of them were already showing signs of rotation. Storm chasers from across the Midwest were converging on Illinois, knowing that this was a potentially historic severe weather outbreak. By early afternoon, several tornadoes had already touched down in various parts of Illinois, causing damage but fortunately no deaths. The atmosphere was absolutely primed for tornadic development, and every storm that formed seemed to be producing a tornado. Around 11 in the morning, a supercell thunderstorm began to organize itself in Tazewell County, just west of Washington. A supercell is a special type of thunderstorm that has a rotating updraft called a mesocyclone. These are the thunderstorms that produce the strongest and longest-lived tornadoes. On radar, this particular supercell looked textbook perfect, and in the worst possible way. It had a clear hook echo, which is a radar signature that indicates the presence of a tornado or the imminent formation of one. The storm was moving to the northeast at about 50 miles per hour, which is extremely fast for a tornadic supercell. This speed would later become one of the most deadly aspects of the Washington tornado, because it gave people very little time to react once the warning was issued. At 11:14 in the morning, the National Weather Service office in Lincoln, Illinois, issued a tornado warning for Tazewell County, including the city of Washington. The warning stated that a confirmed large and extremely dangerous tornado was on the ground and moving toward Washington. This is the kind of warning that makes meteorologists' blood run cold. The words "confirmed large and extremely dangerous" are not used lightly. They indicate that this is a life-threatening situation, and that people need to take shelter immediately. But here's where the true horror of this event begins to unfold. Because of the speed of the storm, residents of Washington had less than 10 minutes from the time the warning was issued until the tornado struck the city. 10 minutes might sound like enough time, but when you factor in that many people were at church, that some didn't receive the warning, that others didn't believe it could happen in November, and that the storm was moving faster than most people could drive, 10 minutes became almost no time at all. The tornado touched down west of Washington at approximately 11:15 in the morning. Witnesses described it as a massive, dark wedge that seemed to fill the entire horizon. A wedge tornado is one where the funnel is as wide as it is tall, sometimes wider, creating a wall of destruction that leaves almost nothing in its path. This tornado was later rated as an EF4 on the enhanced Fujita scale, with estimated wind speeds between 166 and 200 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, those are winds strong enough to pick up and throw vehicles, to strip the bark off trees, to completely demolish well-built homes down to their foundations, and to turn ordinary household items into deadly missiles traveling through the air at incredible speeds. But what made this tornado particularly terrifying, what earned it the designation in some circles as one of the most evil tornadoes ever recorded, was its behavior. Tornadoes are typically described as following the path of least resistance, moving with the prevailing winds and the storm system that creates them. They don't make choices. They don't target specific structures. They simply move according to the atmospheric conditions that formed them. But the Washington tornado seemed to break these rules in ways that have left meteorologists and storm researchers puzzled to this day. As the tornado approached Washington from the west, it did something unusual. Instead of maintaining a straight path, it appeared to slow down and widen as it reached the most densely populated areas of the city. Storm chasers who were following the tornado reported that it seemed to pause, almost as if it were surveying the landscape before it. Then, it tore directly through the heart of Washington's most populated neighborhoods, following streets and seeming to target the areas where the most people lived. This kind of behavior is extremely rare, and has led some researchers to question whether there are aspects of tornado dynamics that we still don't understand. The tornado entered Washington along the southern edge of the city and immediately began causing catastrophic damage. The first homes it struck were completely obliterated. Not damaged, not destroyed, but obliterated. Entire houses were reduced to nothing more than bare concrete slabs and scattered debris. Cars were picked up and thrown hundreds of yards. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped like toothpicks or ripped completely out of the ground. The sound, according to survivors, was unlike anything they had ever heard. Many describe it not as the freight train sound that tornadoes are often compared to, but as a roar that seemed to come from all directions at once, a sound so loud and overwhelming that it was almost impossible to think. One of the most heavily impacted areas was a subdivision called Devonshire. This neighborhood consisted of well-built, modern homes where families had lived for years. Within minutes, Devonshire was completely unrecognizable. Homes that had stood proudly just moments before were now nothing but piles of splintered wood and twisted metal. Personal belongings, family photos, children's toys, furniture, clothing, and the accumulated memories of lifetimes were scattered across the landscape, some items found miles away from where they had originated. The tornado moved through Devonshire with such violence that it changed the very topography of the neighborhood. Where streets and houses had been, there were now only bare foundations and scattered debris fields. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that many families were home when the tornado struck. It was Sunday morning, a time when people were relaxing, having breakfast, getting ready for the day, or returning from church. Some had heard the warnings and had taken shelter in basements or interior rooms. Others either didn't receive the warning in time or didn't believe that a tornado could be that severe. The speed of the tornado meant that even those who did everything right had only minutes to prepare. Families huddled in bathrooms, in closets, in basements, covering themselves with mattresses and blankets, praying that they would survive. And then the tornado hit. The experience of being in a building that is struck by an EF4 tornado is something that defies description. Survivors talk about the pressure change, a feeling like their ears were going to explode, followed by an incredible force that felt like the entire world was being torn apart around them. The sound of their homes disintegrating, of glass shattering, of wood splintering, of metal screeching as it was twisted and torn, all combined into a cacophony of destruction that lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was in reality only seconds. Some survivors reported that they could feel themselves being lifted, that the suction of the tornado was trying to pull them out of their shelters. Others felt debris striking their homes with such force that they were certain they wouldn't survive. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The tornado moved on, leaving behind a landscape that looked like a war zone. Those who emerged from their shelters found themselves in a world that no longer made sense. Homes were gone, streets were unrecognizable, familiar landmarks had vanished. The silence that followed the storm was almost as terrifying as the storm itself. It was the silence of shock, of disbelief, of trying to process what had just happened. But the tornado wasn't finished with Washington yet. After tearing through Devonshire and the surrounding neighborhoods, the tornado continued its path through the eastern part of the city. It struck Washington Community High School, a building where thousands of students spent their days. Fortunately, because it was Sunday, the school was empty, but the damage was catastrophic. Large portions of the school were destroyed. The gymnasium was completely obliterated, and debris from the school was scattered across the surrounding area. The image of the destroyed high school would become one of the iconic symbols of the Washington tornado, a reminder of how much worse the disaster could have been if the tornado had struck on a weekday when the building was full of students. The tornado also struck a senior living facility called Bickford Senior Living. This facility housed elderly residents, many of whom were unable to evacuate or take shelter quickly. The staff at Bickford did everything they could to protect their residents, moving them to interior hallways and away from windows. When the tornado struck, it tore apart large sections of the building. Walls collapsed, roofs were ripped away, and the structure that was supposed to keep these vulnerable people safe became a death trap. The fact that only one resident of the facility died is nothing short of miraculous, and is a testament to the incredible work of the staff who risked their own lives to protect those in their care. As the tornado continued through Washington, it displayed another characteristic that made it particularly dangerous and earned it that designation as evil. It didn't maintain a consistent width or intensity. Instead, it seemed to pulse, narrowing and widening, intensifying and weakening in ways that made it unpredictable. Some streets would be completely devastated while houses on the next street over would be barely touched. This kind of variation is not unusual in tornadoes, but the degree to which it happened in Washington was extreme. It meant that people couldn't predict their safety based on what happened to nearby structures. It meant that survival often came down to sheer luck, being in the right place at the right moment when the tornado happened to narrow or weaken slightly. One of the most disturbing aspects of the tornado's path was how it seemed to follow the streets. Multiple witnesses and later analysis of the damage path showed that the tornado's most intense damage often occurred along roadways, particularly residential streets. This could be explained by the way air flows in urban environments, with streets creating channels that funnel wind, but the degree to which this occurred in Washington was unusual. It gave the unsettling impression that the tornado was hunting, moving down streets and systematically destroying homes one after another. After approximately 10 minutes on the ground in Washington, the tornado finally moved out of the city and continued to the northeast. It stayed on the ground for several more miles, continuing to cause damage to rural areas and smaller communities. In total, the tornado traveled 46 miles and was on the ground for approximately 33 minutes. This made it a long-track tornado, which is another factor that contributed to its devastating impact. Most tornadoes are on the ground for only a few minutes and travel a few miles. The Washington tornado had the time and distance to affect multiple communities and to rack up a damage toll that would eventually reach hundreds of millions of dollars. The immediate aftermath of the tornado was chaos. Emergency services were overwhelmed. The city's 911 system was flooded with calls from people trapped in the rubble of their homes, from people searching for family members, from people injured and needing help. First, responders from Washington and surrounding communities rushed to the scene, but the scale of the destruction was beyond anything they had trained for. Roads were blocked by debris, power lines were down, and the normal landmarks that emergency crews would use to navigate were gone. It was difficult to even determine where streets had been because the landscape had been so thoroughly altered. In the first hours after the tornado, the focus was on search and rescue. Emergency crews went door to door, or rather, foundation to foundation, searching for survivors who might be trapped in the rubble. Neighbors helped neighbors, pulling people from collapsed structures, rendering first aid, sharing shelter with those who had lost their homes. The community of Washington came together in a way that would become a defining characteristic of the recovery. Despite losing everything, people helped each other. Despite being injured themselves, people searched for others who might need help. The human capacity for compassion and resilience was on full display in those terrible hours. As the day wore on and the full extent of the damage became clear, the numbers started to come in. The tornado had damaged or destroyed more than 1,000 structures in Washington alone. Entire neighborhoods, places where hundreds of families had built their lives, were gone. 3 people had been killed in Washington, and dozens more were injured, some critically. The death toll could have been much higher, and the fact that it wasn't is due to a combination of advance warning, people taking shelter, and sheer luck. But 3 deaths is 3 too many, and for the families of those who died, the tornado wasn't just evil, it was a personal tragedy that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The three people who died in Washington were Delnora Broome, aged 77, Joseph Hoy, age 69, and Janice Perdue, age 67. Each of them had a story, a life filled with experiences and relationships, families who loved them, and futures that were stolen by a force of nature. Delnora Broome was known in her community as a kind woman who loved to garden. Joseph Hoy was a retired factory worker who spent his days woodworking and doting on his grandchildren. Janice Perdue was a volunteer at her church and someone who always had a smile for everyone she met. These weren't just statistics. They were real people whose lives ended in the most terrifying way imaginable. In addition to the 3 deaths in Washington, the same tornado system that produced the Washington tornado also produced dozens of other tornadoes across the Midwest on November 17, 2013. The entire outbreak resulted in 8 deaths and hundreds of injuries. It was one of the most significant November tornado outbreaks in recorded history. But the Washington tornado stood out, not just because of the damage it caused, but because of how it caused that damage and the way it seemed to defy our understanding of how tornadoes behave. In the days and weeks following the tornado, researchers from the National Weather Service, from universities, and from various meteorological organizations descended on Washington to conduct damage surveys. Damage surveys are a meticulous process where researchers examine the damage caused by a tornado to determine its rating on the enhanced Fujita scale, and to better understand the tornado's characteristics. What they found in Washington both confirmed and puzzled them. The tornado was rated EF4, which put it in the second highest category on the enhanced Fujita scale. EF5 tornadoes, the highest category, have winds exceeding 200 miles per hour and cause incredible destruction, removing homes completely from their foundations and debarking trees. EF4 tornadoes have winds between 166 and 200 miles per hour and cause severe damage, leveling well-constructed homes and throwing vehicles. The damage in Washington was consistent with EF4 winds, with some areas showing damage that was on the borderline of EF5. However, the determination of EF5 requires very specific types of damage indicators, and while the destruction was catastrophic, it didn't quite meet the threshold for an EF5 rating. What puzzled researchers was the tornado's path and behavior, the way it seemed to intensify as it reached populated areas, the way it followed streets, the pulsing nature of its intensity. All of these factors were unusual. Some researchers speculated that the urban environment itself might have influenced the tornado's behavior. Buildings and streets can affect airflow in complex ways, potentially channeling wind and creating areas of enhanced or reduced damage. But the degree to which this seemed to happen in Washington went beyond typical urban effects on tornadoes. Another aspect that made the Washington tornado particularly notable was the time of year it occurred. November tornadoes are not unheard of, but violent November tornadoes are rare. The atmospheric conditions that create tornadoes typically peak in the spring when temperature contrasts are greatest, and when the jet stream is positioned optimally over the central United States. By November, the jet stream has typically shifted, and the Gulf of Mexico has cooled down enough that the supply of warm, humid air is reduced. But on November 17, 2013, the conditions were perfect, or rather, perfectly terrible. A strong El Niño pattern was present that year, which altered typical weather patterns. The Gulf of Mexico was warmer than normal for November, providing ample moisture. A powerful jet stream dip brought cold air much further south than usual, and the wind shear, that crucial ingredient for strong tornadoes, was extreme. The fact that such a violent tornado occurred in November serves as a reminder that tornadoes can happen any time of year, and that complacency is dangerous. Many people in Washington later admitted that when they heard the warning, they didn't take it as seriously as they should have because it was November. They thought, how bad could a November tornado really be? The answer, as they discovered, is that a November tornado can be just as deadly as a spring tornado, perhaps even more so because people aren't expecting it. The recovery from the Washington tornado would take years, and in many ways is still ongoing. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was on clearing debris, restoring utilities, and helping displaced families find shelter. The American Red Cross set up shelters for those who had lost their homes. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, arrived to assess the damage and provide disaster assistance. Insurance adjusters flooded the area, trying to process the thousands of claims from homeowners whose properties had been damaged or destroyed. But beyond the physical recovery, there was an emotional and psychological recovery that had to take place. Experiencing a violent tornado leaves scars that aren't visible. Many survivors of the Washington tornado developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the tornado. They became anxious when clouds appeared or when the weather turned stormy. The sound of wind, something that most people barely notice, became a trigger that brought back the memories of that terrible day. Children who had been in the tornado had trouble sleeping, became clingy with their parents, and struggled in school. Adults found it difficult to concentrate at work, to make decisions, to feel safe in their own homes. The community of Washington, however, showed incredible resilience. Neighbors helped neighbors rebuild. Local churches and organizations provided support. National organizations came in to help with construction and to provide counseling services. Slowly, painfully, the community began to rebuild. New homes were constructed on the empty foundations where old homes had stood. The high school was repaired and rebuilt. Parks were restored. Life, in many ways, returned to normal. But normal wasn't quite the same as it had been before. The tornado had changed Washington in fundamental ways. The community was stronger in some respects, bound together by shared trauma and shared recovery. But there was also a sense of loss, not just of the physical structures that had been destroyed, but of innocence and of the feeling of safety that people had felt in their homes. Washington would forever be divided into before the tornado and after the tornado. One of the most important lessons from the Washington tornado has to do with warnings and preparedness. The National Weather Service issued a warning 14 minutes before the tornado struck Washington. 14 minutes might not sound like much, but in the world of tornado warnings, it's actually quite good. Many tornadoes form so rapidly that warnings are issued only a few minutes before impact, or sometimes even after a tornado is already on the ground. The 14-minute lead time should have been enough for most people to take shelter. So, why were people still caught off guard? There are several reasons. First, as mentioned earlier, it was November. People simply weren't as vigilant about severe weather as they would have been in April or May. Second, the speed of the storm meant that even with a 14-minute warning, the tornado arrived faster than people expected. Third, and this is a problem that affects tornado warnings across the country, some people didn't receive the warning at all. They didn't have their phones on, they weren't watching television, they weren't listening to the radio, and they didn't hear the warning sirens or dismiss them as tests or false alarms. Fourth, some people who did receive the warning didn't believe it applied to them. They thought the tornado would miss their area or wouldn't be as bad as the warning indicated. This is a phenomenon that meteorologists and emergency managers struggle with constantly. How do you get people to take warnings seriously without causing panic or warning fatigue? If you issue too many warnings and tornadoes don't materialize, people stop paying attention. But if you don't issue warnings early enough or strongly enough, people don't have time to take shelter. The Washington tornado hit during a period when the National Weather Service was experimenting with different warning language trying to find ways to convey urgency without causing unnecessary alarm. The language used in the Washington warning, describing the tornado as confirmed, large, and extremely dangerous, was about as strong as it could be, and yet some people still didn't take it seriously enough. In the years since the Washington tornado, there have been improvements in warning systems and in our understanding of how to communicate risk. Impact-based warnings, which specifically describe what a tornado will do rather than just its meteorological characteristics, have become more common. For example, instead of just saying a tornado warning is in effect, warnings now might say that the tornado is capable of causing complete destruction of homes and that people need to take shelter immediately. These kinds of descriptions are designed to cut through the noise and to make people understand the real danger they're facing. The Washington tornado also highlighted the importance of having multiple ways to receive warnings. Relying on just one method, whether it's sirens or television or radio, is not enough. Sirens can't be heard indoors. Television and radio require power, and for people to be paying attention. And phone alerts can fail if cell towers are damaged or if phones are on silent. The most effective warning system is one that uses multiple methods simultaneously, giving people the best chance of receiving the warning no matter what they're doing or where they are. Another important aspect of the Washington tornado that deserves attention is the role that storm chasers and spotters played. On November 17, 2013, dozens of storm chasers were in Illinois, tracking the storms and providing real-time information to the National Weather Service. These chasers were able to confirm that the Washington tornado was on the ground and to describe its size and intensity, information that was then relayed in warning updates. Local storm spotters, trained volunteers who watch for severe weather and report what they see, also played a crucial role. Without the eyes on the ground provided by chasers and spotters, the warnings might not have been as specific or as urgent. However, the presence of so many chasers also created problems. Roads around Washington were congested with both chasers and residents trying to evacuate, which potentially put people at greater risk. There's an ongoing debate in the storm chasing community about ethics and safety, about where the line is between documenting tornadoes for scientific and educational purposes versus getting in the way of emergency operations and putting oneself and others at risk. The Washington tornado brought some of these issues to the forefront, particularly because it occurred in a populated area where roads were not designed for the kind of traffic that a major tornado event generates. The footage and photographs from the Washington tornado are among some of the most dramatic ever captured. Video shows the massive wedge tornado tearing through neighborhoods, homes exploding into clouds of debris, cars being tossed like toys. These images are both terrifying and mesmerizing, and they've been viewed millions of times online. For researchers, this documentation is invaluable. It provides insights into how tornadoes damage structures, how debris becomes airborne, and how people can better protect themselves. But for the people of Washington, these images are painful reminders of the worst day of their lives. There's a tension between the scientific and public interest value of tornado footage and the respect for the privacy and trauma of those who lived through it. One of the aspects of the Washington tornado that's often discussed is whether climate change played a role. This is a complicated question and one that scientists are still working to answer. Individual weather events, including tornadoes, cannot be directly attributed to climate change. Weather is chaotic and variable, and tornadoes have been occurring for as long as we have records. However, climate change is affecting the atmospheric conditions that create severe weather. Warmer temperatures mean more energy available in the atmosphere. Changes in the jet stream's behavior, possibly linked to Arctic warming, can create more extreme weather patterns. Warmer ocean temperatures, including in the Gulf of Mexico, provide more moisture for storms. What researchers are finding is that while the total number of tornadoes might not be increasing, the distribution and timing of tornadoes may be changing. There's some evidence that tornado activity is becoming more variable, with longer periods of inactivity followed by intense outbreaks. There's also evidence that the peak of tornado season might be shifting slightly earlier in the year, and that tornadoes are becoming more common in the southeast, while potentially decreasing slightly in parts of the traditional tornado alley. The occurrence of a violent tornado in November, while not unprecedented, does fit into a pattern of increased variability and out-of-season events. It's important to note that the science here is still developing, and that attributing any single event to climate change is not straightforward. But what is clear is that communities need to be prepared for severe weather year-round, not just during traditional tornado season. The Washington tornado is a perfect example of why complacency based on the calendar is dangerous. The economic impact of the Washington tornado was staggering. Initial damage estimates put the cost at over $200 million, making it one of the most expensive tornadoes in Illinois history. This figure includes the cost of destroyed and damaged homes, businesses, public buildings like the high school, infrastructure including roads and utilities, and the loss of personal property. Insurance companies paid out hundreds of millions in claims. But the true economic cost goes beyond these figures. There's the cost of lost productivity as businesses were closed and people were displaced. There's the cost of mental health services for survivors dealing with trauma. There's the cost of decreased property values in some areas, and the cost to the city's tax base as properties were removed from the rolls while they were being rebuilt. For individual families, the financial impact was often devastating. Many homeowners discovered that their insurance didn't cover the full cost of rebuilding. Deductibles were high, and some policies had limitations on what they would pay for. Renters, many of whom didn't have renter's insurance, lost everything and received little financial assistance. People who had cars damaged or destroyed found that their auto insurance didn't fully cover the loss. The financial stress added to the emotional trauma, creating a compound effect that made recovery even more difficult. On a more positive note, the response from the broader community and from people across the country was overwhelming. Donations poured in to help Washington recover. Volunteer organizations like the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and various faith-based groups provided immediate assistance. Construction companies and volunteers came from across the region to help with rebuilding. Schools held fundraisers. Businesses donated supplies. The generosity of strangers helped the people of Washington begin to rebuild their lives. The Washington tornado also had a significant impact on tornado research and on how we understand tornadoes. The detailed damage surveys conducted after the tornado provided valuable data about how EF4 tornadoes affect different types of structures. Researchers were able to examine how homes built to different code standards performed, which has implications for building codes going forward. They studied how debris becomes airborne and how far it travels, which helps in understanding the danger zones around tornadoes. They analyzed the radar data from the tornado, looking at its formation, intensification, and decay, trying to understand what made it behave the way it did. One area of particular interest has been the tornado's movement and path. Using GPS technology and comparing before and after satellite imagery, researchers were able to map the tornado's path with incredible precision. They could see exactly where the most intense damage occurred and how the tornado's width and intensity varied along its path. This kind of detailed analysis helps build better models of tornado behavior, which can eventually lead to better forecasts and warnings. The Washington tornado also contributed to ongoing research into tornado dynamics, the physics of how tornadoes form and behave. One of the big questions in tornado research is what causes some tornadoes to become violent while others remain weak. Another question is what determines a tornado's path, and whether there are predictable factors that influence how tornadoes move. The Washington tornado, with its unusual behavior and well-documented path, provided a case study that researchers continue to analyze. Some researchers have looked at the specific atmospheric conditions present on November 17, 2013, trying to understand what combination of factors produced such a violent tornado. The wind shear on that day was extreme, with winds changing speed and direction dramatically with height. This kind of shear creates the rotation in supercell thunderstorms that can then be focused into a tornado. The storm relative helicity, a measure of the potential for rotating updrafts, was very high. The amount of instability in the atmosphere, measured by something called CAPE, or convective available potential energy, was significant for November. All of these factors together created a perfect environment for violent tornadoes, but beyond the meteorology, there's also the human story of the Washington tornado. The story of how a community responded to tragedy and how individuals found the strength to carry on. In the months and years following the tornado, reporters and researchers interviewed dozens of survivors, documenting their experiences and their recovery. These stories are both heartbreaking and inspiring. There's the story of a mother who sheltered in a bathtub with her 2 young children, covering them with her body as the tornado ripped her home apart around them. She suffered injuries from debris, but her children were unharmed. She credits the bathtub and her decision to act immediately when she heard the warning with saving their lives. Today, she still struggles with anxiety during storms, but she's rebuilt her home on the same lot and is determined to move forward. There's the story of an elderly man who rode out the tornado in his basement. When he emerged, his home was completely gone, nothing left but the foundation. He had lived in that house for 40 years, had raised his children there, had shared it with his wife before she passed away. Everything he owned, every memory, every photograph, was scattered across the neighborhood. He stood on his empty foundation and wept. But with the help of his children and his neighbors, he rebuilt. He designed his new home to include a reinforced safe room, and he's become an advocate for stronger building codes and better tornado preparedness. There's the story of a teacher from Washington High School who wasn't at the school when it was hit, but who spent the following months helping her students cope with the trauma. Many of her students had lost their homes, and all of them were dealing with the shock of seeing their school destroyed. She organized counseling sessions, created safe spaces for students to talk about their feelings, and worked tirelessly to maintain some sense of normalcy and routine in the midst of chaos. Her dedication helped dozens of students get through one of the hardest times of their lives. There's the story of first responders who pulled people from the rubble, who worked 30-hour shifts without rest, who saw things that will haunt them forever but who kept going because people needed help. There's the story of utility workers who worked around the clock to restore power, often in dangerous conditions with debris everywhere and structures unstable. There's the story of volunteers who came from other states to help with cleanup and rebuilding, who took time off from their jobs and away from their families to help total strangers. These stories illustrate something important about disasters like the Washington tornado. While the tornado itself might be described as evil because of the destruction it caused and the seemingly malicious way it targeted populated areas, the response to the tornado showed the best of humanity. People helping people, strangers becoming friends, communities coming together in ways that wouldn't have happened without the tragedy. The Washington tornado also became a case study in emergency management. The response from local, state, and federal agencies was analyzed to determine what worked and what could be improved. Overall, the response was considered successful, particularly given the scale of the disaster. The National Weather Service's warnings were timely and clear. Local emergency managers activated their emergency plans quickly and effectively. First responders performed heroically. The coordination between different agencies was generally good. However, there were also lessons learned. Communication between agencies could have been better in some instances. The shelter system was overwhelmed initially, and more capacity was needed. The distribution of supplies and aid wasn't always efficient. Some vulnerable populations, particularly elderly and disabled residents, had difficulty getting the help they needed quickly enough. These lessons have been incorporated into emergency plans, not just in Washington but in communities across the country. One of the most significant changes that came out of the Washington tornado was an increased emphasis on safe rooms and tornado shelters. In the aftermath of the tornado, there was a push to make tornado shelters more accessible and affordable for residents. Some communities in Tornado Alley have implemented programs that help homeowners install safe rooms, providing grants or low-interest loans. Schools and public buildings are increasingly being built with reinforced areas designed to withstand tornadoes. A safe room is a hardened shelter, either in a home or a separate structure, designed to provide protection from tornadoes and hurricanes. Safe rooms are built to very specific standards set by FEMA, capable of withstanding winds of up to 250 miles per hour and impacts from flying debris. Studies have shown that safe rooms are highly effective at preventing deaths and injuries during tornadoes. Had every home in Washington had a safe room, it's likely that no one would have died in the tornado. The challenge is cost. A safe room can cost several $1,000s to install, which is beyond the reach of many families. There's an ongoing debate about whether governments should subsidize safe rooms, making them available to everyone, or whether they should remain a personal responsibility. Some argue that in tornado-prone areas, safe rooms should be required by building codes, just like fire safety measures are required. Others argue that this would place an undue burden on homeowners and builders. The Washington tornado has also affected how meteorologists communicate about tornadoes. In the years since 2013, there's been a shift toward more urgent and specific language when describing dangerous tornadoes. Phrases like life-threatening situation and complete destruction are used more frequently. Some meteorologists have started using terms like tornado emergency for the most dangerous situations, a term that's not an official National Weather Service product, but has become widely used to indicate that a violent tornado is affecting or about to affect a populated area. This shift in communication is partly a response to the recognition that traditional warning language wasn't getting through to people. Simply saying that a tornado warning is in effect doesn't convey the urgency and danger of a situation like the Washington tornado. By using more dramatic and specific language, meteorologists hope to cut through the noise and make people understand that they need to act immediately. However, there's a risk to this approach. If every warning uses the most urgent language possible, people might start to tune it out, leading to warning fatigue. It's a delicate balance, one that meteorologists and emergency managers are constantly trying to get right. The goal is to reserve the most urgent language for situations that truly warrant it, like the Washington tornado, while still ensuring that all tornado warnings are taken seriously. The Washington tornado has entered the consciousness of meteorologists and weather enthusiasts as one of those benchmark events, a tornado that's studied and remembered because of its significance. It's often mentioned in the same breath as other notorious tornadoes like the Joplin, Missouri tornado of 2011, the Moore, Oklahoma tornadoes, or the Tuscaloosa, Alabama tornado. Each of these events had its own characteristics and its own story, but they all share the common thread of being violent tornadoes that struck populated areas and caused tremendous loss. What makes the Washington tornado particularly memorable is the time of year it occurred and the behavior it exhibited. Most people, even those who live in tornado-prone areas don't expect a violent tornado in November. And the way the tornadoes seem to target populated areas, following streets and intensifying at the worst possible times, gives it an almost malevolent character, hence the description of it being evil. Of course, tornadoes aren't actually evil. They're natural phenomena, the result of specific atmospheric conditions coming together in a particular way. They don't have intent or malice. They don't choose their targets. But when a tornado causes as much destruction and trauma as the Washington tornado did, and when it seems to behave in ways that are unusual and frightening, it's natural for people to ascribe human characteristics to it. It's a way of trying to make sense of something that feels senseless, of trying to understand the ununderstandable. In the scientific community, describing a tornado as evil would be inappropriate. But even scientists acknowledge that some tornadoes are more dangerous and more destructive than others, and the Washington tornado certainly falls into that category. Its combination of strength, size, speed, and path through a populated area made it one of the most dangerous tornadoes in recent history. The legacy of the Washington tornado continues to this day. The city has rebuilt, and in many ways, it's stronger than before. New homes have been constructed to higher standards. The community has a deeper understanding of tornado risk and a greater commitment to preparedness. The high school was rebuilt with enhanced safety features. Memorials have been erected to remember those who died and to honor the resilience of those who survived. But the scars remain. Not all of the empty lots have been rebuilt. Some families never returned to Washington, choosing to start over somewhere else. The psychological impact on survivors continues to manifest in various ways, and the knowledge that it could happen again, that another November day could bring another violent tornado, is always in the back of people's minds. One of the questions that survivors often ask is why? Why did this happen? Why did the tornado hit my house but spare my neighbors? Why did I survive when others didn't? These questions don't have satisfying answers. Tornadoes are chaotic and random in their destruction. The difference between life and death, between losing everything and being spared, can come down to being a few feet one way or another, to a split-second decision, to pure chance. It's one of the hardest aspects of surviving a disaster like the Washington tornado, the randomness of it all. For meteorologists and emergency managers, the Washington tornado serves as a constant reminder of the importance of their work. Every warning that's issued, every forecast that's made, every decision about how to communicate risk has the potential to save lives or, if done poorly, to cost lives. The pressure and responsibility are immense. When the warnings work and people take shelter and survive, the meteorologists rarely get credit. But when warnings fail, or when people don't heed them and disasters occur, the scrutiny is intense. The meteorologists who worked on November 17, 2013, did their jobs well. They identified the threat, they issued timely warnings, they used strong language to convey the danger. And yet, 3 people still died, and hundreds more were injured. It's a sobering reminder that even when everything is done right, tornadoes are still deadly. Perfect warnings can't save everyone, especially when tornadoes are as powerful and fast-moving as the Washington tornado was. In the years since the tornado, Washington has held annual remembrance events. These gatherings serve multiple purposes. They honor the memory of those who died. They allow survivors to come together and support each other. They remind the community of how far they've come in recovery. And they serve as a teaching opportunity, a chance to remind new residents and younger people about the tornado threat and the importance of preparedness. These events are bittersweet. There's pride in how the community has recovered, but there's also sadness for what was lost. There's gratitude for the help that was received, but also frustration that it was needed in the first place. There's hope for the future, but also fear that history could repeat itself. These conflicting emotions are a natural part of living in a place that's been affected by a major disaster. The Washington tornado also highlighted the role of social media in disaster response. In 2013, social media was already widespread, but its use during disasters was still evolving. During and after the Washington tornado, social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter became crucial tools for communication. People used them to let friends and family know they were safe. They shared information about where to find shelter and supplies. They posted photos and videos of the damage. They organized volunteer efforts and fundraisers. But social media also created challenges. Misinformation spread quickly. Rumors about the death toll, about where the tornado was headed, about what resources were available, all circulated and sometimes caused confusion. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, making it difficult to sort out what was accurate and important. In the years since, emergency management agencies have gotten better at using social media effectively, but the Washington tornado was an early example of both the potential and the pitfalls of social media during disasters. Looking back on the Washington tornado more than a decade later, what can we learn? First and foremost, we learn that tornadoes can happen any time of year, and that we need to be prepared year-round. We learn that warnings, no matter how good, are only effective if people receive them and take them seriously. We learn that the difference between life and death in a tornado often comes down to seconds and decisions. We learn that communities can recover from even the most devastating disasters, but that recovery is a long and difficult process. We learn that building codes and safe rooms can save lives and that investing in these protections is worthwhile. We learn that the human spirit is incredibly resilient and that people are capable of extraordinary compassion and strength in the face of tragedy. The Washington tornado of November 17, 2013, was a terrible event that changed the lives of thousands of people. It killed 3 people, injured dozens more, destroyed hundreds of homes, and caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. It exhibited behavior that was unusual and frightening, seeming to target populated areas and intensifying at the worst possible moments. It struck at a time of year when people weren't expecting it, catching many off guard. It moved so quickly that even good warnings provided limited time to react. But the tornado also revealed the strength of the human spirit and the power of communities to come together in crisis. It showed that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, people can rebuild and recover. It reminded us that nature is powerful and unpredictable, and that we need to respect that power and prepare for it. It taught meteorologists and emergency managers valuable lessons about how to communicate risk and how to respond to disasters. It pushed forward research into tornado behavior and building codes and warning systems. The Washington tornado will never be forgotten by those who lived through it. For the rest of us, it serves as a powerful reminder of the awesome and terrible power of nature and of our need to be prepared for whatever might come our way. If you want to learn more about extreme weather events and how to stay safe, make sure to subscribe to the channel.